What excuses would you use to get out of an exam, a university exam, unwell, family bereavement, or legitimate excuses, or just the classic, the dog ate
Nobody's ever used dog ate my notes, ever.
Do you think?
No. What about, this is where the story turns slightly serious, what about racial trauma? What does that phrase even necessarily mean?
Because Goldsmiths University has bowed to pressure from its student union to incorporate racial trauma as a reason to defer essays and exams for black students and ethnic minority students, and this will be done through self-certification. So we're showing you a tweet there from the Goldsmiths student union president, and she says the university has agreed to our proposal to incorporate racial trauma as a reason to defer essays and exams, which means you would be allowed to do it later or have an extended deadline for black and people of colour students, which doesn't make great grammatical sense. But, you know, as she says, it will be done through self-certification, which basically means you won't have to provide evidence of what this racial trauma said, what this racial trauma means. And we did reach out to Goldsmiths University this morning. And Professor Francis Corner, who is the warden of Goldsmiths University, said this change relates to our extenuating circumstances policy, which enables students to ask us to take into account serious life events when assessing their progress with their studies. Categories include medical conditions, trauma, bereavement, court attendance and caring responsibilities, and racial trauma will now be added to this list.
This statement goes on, we've put this to Goldsmiths, the statement goes on, self-certification for this kind of support is common at universities and students are entitled to proper support when the need arises. A student must submit a detailed statement which is carefully considered by academic departments who then decide an appropriate response.
They say applications are decided on a case-by-case basis with the college committing to providing the best possible support. So, you know, racial trauma is now being added at this particular university anyway, Goldsmiths University, to the list of excuses. A lot of people take issue with that word, but excuses, reasons that you can use to get out of an exam or, you know, have your deadline extended. On an essay, I just find this ridiculous, and I do want to, because I know I'll get in trouble for making this point, so I do want to qualify it with saying, first of all, if somebody is abused, and that includes racial abuse, and that affects them, then fine, that is another situation. If you've experienced abuse and you can show that, and, you know, fine. But this is something completely different, isn't it? This is a racial trauma, and actually the president there of the student union, she goes on to describe it as, well, it's institutional racism. If you're experiencing institutional racism, well, that affects you, and you should be able to sort of use that as a kind of a general excuse to get out of an exam. So it's it's this abstract concept of racial trauma. I mean, what would even classify as racial trauma?
Well, it's the definition that we struggle with.
Yes,
how are you going to define it? Where's the process? Where is the process? I mean, if you are potentially doing something career-changing, I mean, if you get an exam that's marked in a different way, or an essay that should be in today but it comes in next week, and you are saying to some people, if they can demonstrate, actually not even demonstrate, if they can simply claim to have been disadvantaged by racial trauma, that they will then be given certain dispensations. You get different bars for different people. There is also the question of this idea of self-certification. It's what you perceive to be an act of racial trauma. I mean, some people who talk about this talk about it going back all the way to the Macpherson report, which said perceived acts of hate crime are those which you perceive them to be. There needs to be no demonstrable process by which an evidential bar is reached. If you think something's happened to you which is motivated by hate, how you see it is all that really matters. And that's this story seems to be an exemplification of that, in quotes, logic that says if you feel hard done by, if you are a victim of racial trauma, you claim racial trauma, you don't necessarily need to go through a process that demonstrates that beyond reasonable doubt. The mere act of claiming it entitles you to the dispensation. I think, Mercy, what some people will say, and I know you will say, because I know you're thinking on this, is that it will encourage a sense of victimhood and grievance mongering, which actually is to the disadvantage of some of the people who ought to be benefiting from it.
Absolutely, and just to read you this second tweet from the Sarah, who's the student union president there. She says institutional / systemic racism, which clearly impacts black and coloured students, people of colour, the ability to submit essays or exams due to the trauma of it. So she's saying it's not quite the one we're showing there, it's a tweet she tweeted after that. But
that's the key tweet, and we'll keep that up.
That's the key tweet, but she was clarifying that it's the institutional and systemic racism which affects their ability to submit the essays. So she's saying this broader concept of institutional racism in and of itself affects the ability of students to submit essays. And I just think, you're just encouraging, firstly, you're encouraging black students, ethnic minority students, to just always kind of see things through this lens of institutional racism, which some of them will inevitably do so, but some of them won't. They won't. Institutional racism is a contested concept, and so this idea that all black students will be affected by it.
If we just pull the tweet back up, I mean, mostly what some people say when they read that, and let's just put some of the sort of counterpoints up on this one. Some people will read that and say, okay, so a president of a students' union has said something which a lot of mainstream opinion might find to be pretty potty. It was ever thus. I suppose it's arguable, isn't it, that actually what's increasingly happening, and one of the reasons we see this apparent obsession at the moment, and I think necessarily with what's broadly described as the culture wars, is that what began life in the academy on the campuses of America seems to have made the transatlantic journey across to the UK. Now, some people say, well, if it stays there, that's fine. If it stays in the dreamy spires of Goldsmiths College, part of the University of London, that's where it can stay. It doesn't really affect anybody in real life, in the real world, except that it does, doesn't it? We know now that very often there's a bleed through and a leach from academia into corporate life, into the third sector, into NGOs, into various institutions which want to fall in line. So that's why we're identifying this story, because it's introducing a new piece of language and, in a sense, a new misdemeanour that may become part of the mainstream. And also, I
think, so the statement from the university, it said a student must submit a detailed statement which is carefully considered by academics who then decide an appropriate response. That's completely disingenuous. You want to tell me that me, as a black student, if I was going to Goldsmith and I said, I'm experiencing racial trauma, I don't need to give you evidence, so I need to miss my exam next week, or I need to get an extension on my deadline. You really want to tell me in the current climate that we're at, you're going to have a white professor, and the vast majority of professors are white, sit there and have the confidence to tell any black student who's coming to them with this that, no, sorry, I don't think it's a legitimate excuse. They're not going to be able to do that.
It's so pernicious, insidious and ultimately corrosive, this, because my own teenage children, let's say my own teenage children are in the same class as the Students' Union president there, who's advocating this kind of dispensation. They can't get their exams in late, or if they can, they've got to give a really good excuse, and racial trauma would not be one of them.
Well, yeah, I actually, anecdote, I have a daughter, and I had a baby whilst at university, and she was actually ill during a time where I had a deadline, and I asked for an extension, and they said no. They said, family illness is not a reason to get an extension.
You feel as keenly.
So I just thought, well, maybe I should have just said I had racial trauma instead, and maybe that would have got me.
You heard it here first. Let us know what you think about that one at GBNews for your thoughts. Try and keep it polite, and we'll be engaging with this one constructively. And thank you to Goldsmiths for drafting a statement as quickly as you did. We'll do more on this story as and when.